Sarah Chen walked into the military base cafeteria like any other Tuesday morning. Her flight suit looked exactly like everyone else's, and she carried her helmet with the same casual confidence as the other pilots. Nobody paid much attention to the quiet woman who always sat alone at the corner table, reading technical manuals while eating her breakfast. The other pilots knew her as Chen from maintenance. She fixed their planes, ran diagnostics, and made sure every bolt was tight before they took off. What they didn't know was that Sarah had been flying since she was 12 years old. Her grandfather, a Korean War veteran, had taught her in his old Cessna on weekends. By 16, she was already better than most commercial pilots. Sarah had tried to join the Air Force as a pilot when she was 18. She passed every test, aced every simulation, and impressed every instructor. But there was a problem with her paperwork. A clerical error had marked her as having failed a medical exam she had never even taken. By the time the mistake was discovered, the training slots were full. The recruiter suggested she try again next year. Next year came, and the same thing happened. Then the year after that. Each time, there was always some excuse, some reason why she couldn't get into pilot training. Sarah began to suspect it wasn't really about paperwork or timing. She was one of only 3 Asian women trying to become fighter pilots in her region. And somehow, the system kept finding ways to say no. Frustrated but not defeated, Sarah took a job as an aircraft mechanic. If she couldn't fly the planes, she would at least work with them every day. She learned everything about F-16 seconds, F-22 seconds, and every other aircraft on the base. She studied their systems until she knew them better than the pilots who flew them. During her lunch breaks, Sarah would sit in the empty cockpits and practice. She memorized every switch, every dial, every emergency procedure. The maintenance chief sometimes found her there and would shake his head, thinking she was just another mechanic who dreamed of being something more. What the maintenance chief didn't know was that Sarah had been secretly taking civilian flying lessons. Every weekend, she drove 2 hours to a small airport where she rented time in advanced aircraft. She had earned her commercial pilot license, her instrument rating, and even her aerobatic certification. Her instructor, a former Navy pilot named Mike, was amazed by her natural ability. Mike had flown with hundreds of students over the years, but Sarah was different. She seemed to understand aircraft in a way that couldn't be taught. She could feel when something was wrong with an engine before any instrument showed a problem. She could land in crosswinds that would challenge pilots with 20 years of experience. One day, Mike suggested that Sarah try some combat maneuvers in his retired training aircraft. It was just a modified civilian plane, but it could handle some basic fighter tactics. Sarah agreed, thinking it would be fun to try something new. The moment she pushed the aircraft into its first combat turn, something clicked. Sarah felt like she had been born to do this. The G-forces that made other students sick barely affected her. Complex maneuvers that took most pilots months to learn came naturally to her. Mike watched in amazement as Sarah performed rolls, loops, and tactical turns like she had been doing them for years. After 6 months of weekend training with Mike, Sarah could outfly most of the active-duty pilots on her base. She knew this because she had studied their flight patterns, their techniques, their strengths and weaknesses. During her maintenance work, she listened to their radio chatter and noticed their mistakes. But Sarah kept quiet about her abilities. She had learned that the military wasn't ready for someone like her. Instead, she focused on being the best mechanic she could be. She worked extra shifts, volunteered for difficult repairs, and never complained about the long hours. The other pilots began to trust her completely. When Captain Rodriguez had a problem with his F-16's navigation system, he specifically requested that Sarah work on it. When Lieutenant Brooks needed someone to inspect his aircraft after a hard landing, he wanted Sarah to do the check. They knew that when Sarah signed off on an aircraft, it was ready to fly. Sarah's reputation as a mechanic grew throughout the base. Pilots would delay their flights if she wasn't available to do their pre-flight inspections. They trusted her more than they trusted some of their fellow pilots. What they didn't know was that Sarah was studying their flying techniques every time she worked on their planes. She noticed that Captain Miller always came back with his aircraft slightly out of trim, suggesting he was heavy on the controls during flight. Lieutenant Jackson's plane often showed signs of aggressive maneuvering that wasn't necessary for his training missions. Sarah could read the story of each flight in the wear patterns on the aircraft, the fuel consumption records, and the stress marks on various components. Years passed, and Sarah continued her double life. By day, she was just another mechanic in a flight suit. By night, and on weekends, she was becoming one of the most skilled pilots in the region. Mike had introduced her to other retired military pilots, and word spread quietly through their community about the mechanic who could fly like an ace. Some of these retired pilots had connections to air shows and civilian aerobatic competitions. They invited Sarah to participate, but she always declined. She couldn't risk anyone from her base seeing her fly. If they discovered her abilities, it might cause problems for her job. Instead, Sarah satisfied herself with occasional flights with Mike and his friends. They would take her up in different aircraft, challenging her with new situations and aircraft types. Sarah mastered each one quickly, adapting to different flight characteristics and systems with ease that impressed even veteran pilots. One retired pilot, a former test pilot named Colonel Davis, told Mike that Sarah was the most naturally gifted pilot he had ever seen. He had flown with astronauts, Blue Angels, and Thunderbirds, but Sarah's combination of technical knowledge and flying instinct was unique. The secret began to weigh on Sarah. She loved her work as a mechanic, but every day she watched other pilots take off in aircraft. She knew she could fly better. She saw them make mistakes, take unnecessary risks, and return from missions that she knew she could have completed more efficiently. Sarah started to wonder if she was wasting her talents. Maybe she should leave the military and become a commercial pilot, or join a civilian aerobatics team. But something kept her at the base. She felt connected to the aircraft and the mission, even if she wasn't officially part of the flying operations. Then one morning, everything changed. Sarah was in the hangar, working on a routine maintenance check of an F-22 Raptor, when the base alarm sounded. Emergency tones echoed through every building, and the loudspeaker crackled to life with an urgent announcement. An unidentified aircraft had entered restricted airspace and wasn't responding to radio contact. The base needed to scramble fighters immediately to intercept and identify the threat. Sarah looked up from her work as pilots ran toward their aircraft, pulling on flight gear as they moved. But something was wrong. Sarah could see the confusion on the faces of the maintenance crews. She heard worried conversations between the crew chiefs. As she listened, she realized the problem was serious. 3 of the base's 4 operational F-22 seconds were down for maintenance. One had engine trouble. Another had a damaged radar system. And the third was missing a critical computer component that wouldn't arrive until next week. The only operational Raptor was the one Sarah had been working on. But there was another problem. The pilot assigned to that aircraft was Lieutenant Brooks, and he had called in sick that morning with food poisoning. The backup pilot, Captain Rodriguez, was at a training conference 3 states away. The third qualified pilot was Major Thompson, but she was on emergency leave because her father had suffered a heart attack. Sarah listened as the maintenance chief tried to explain to the operations officer that they might need to use an F-16 instead of the F-22. But the unidentified aircraft was flying a pattern that suggested it might be testing the base's response time and capabilities. They needed their most advanced fighter in the air as quickly as possible. The operations officer looked around desperately. Every qualified pilot was either sick, away, or assigned to aircraft that couldn't fly. The situation was becoming critical. The unidentified aircraft was getting closer to sensitive areas of the base, and they needed to respond immediately. Sarah realized that in a few minutes, someone was going to have to make a very difficult decision. The base needed a pilot, and she was the only person in the hangar who could actually fly the F-22 that was ready to go. But nobody knew about her abilities. She watched as officers made urgent phone calls, trying to find any available pilot who could be brought to the base quickly. But even if they found someone, it would take at least 30 minutes for them to arrive, get briefed, and launch. The unidentified aircraft would be long gone by then. Sarah looked at the F-22 she had just finished maintaining. She knew every system in that aircraft better than anyone else on the base. She had studied the flight manual countless times and had practiced emergency procedures in her head hundreds of times. In her civilian training, she had flown aircraft with similar fly-by-wire systems and advanced avionics. The moment of decision was approaching fast. Sarah could remain quiet and let the situation unfold without her involvement, or she could step forward and reveal her secret, knowing that it would change everything about her life and career. The base alarm continued to sound as Sarah made her choice. Sarah stepped forward and cleared her throat. The hangar suddenly felt quiet despite all the activity around her. "Sir," she said to the operations officer, "I can fly the Raptor." Major Peterson looked at her like she had just suggested she could grow wings and fly herself. "Chen, this isn't the time for jokes. We need a qualified pilot." Chen. "I am qualified, sir. I have over 1,000 hours of flight time, and I'm certified on similar aircraft systems." Sarah's voice was steady, but her heart was racing. She was about to reveal the secret she had kept for 5 years. The maintenance chief, Sergeant Williams, stared at her in disbelief. "Chen, you're a mechanic. What are you talking about?" Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out her pilot's license and certifications. She handed them to Major Peterson, who looked at them with growing amazement. The documents showed extensive flight training, aerobatic certification, and instrument ratings that few pilots on the base possessed. "How is this possible?" Major Peterson asked. "Why didn't you tell us you could fly?" "Long story, sir. But right now, that aircraft is getting closer to our restricted zones. I know this F-22 inside and out. I just finished the maintenance check myself. She's ready to fly. And so am I." The radio crackled with an urgent update. The unidentified aircraft was now only 15 minutes from a classified research facility. The base commander's voice came over the intercom, demanding an immediate response. There was no more time for discussion. Major Peterson made the fastest decision of his career. "Chen, get suited up. We'll sort out the paperwork later." Sarah ran to the pilot-ready room, where she kept a flight suit that actually fit her properly. She had bought it herself years ago, hoping that someday she might need it. As she put on the flight gear, other mechanics and ground crew watched in amazement. Nobody could believe what was happening. The crew chief helped Sarah strap into the F-22's cockpit. He had seen her sit there during maintenance breaks. But now, she moved with the confidence of someone who belonged there. She started flipping switches and checking systems with practiced efficiency. "Chen," the crew chief said through the headset, "are you sure about this?" "More sure than I've ever been about anything," Sarah replied. Her hands moved over the controls like she had been flying F-22 seconds her entire life. Every system came online perfectly. The aircraft responded to her touch as if it recognized her. The tower cleared her for immediate takeoff. Sarah taxied to the runway with smooth precision, her movements confident and controlled. In the control tower, Major Peterson watched nervously. He had just authorized a mechanic to take off in a $40 million fighter aircraft based on a pilot's license and a desperate situation. Sarah lined up on the runway and advanced the throttles. The F-22's twin engines roared to life, pushing her back into the seat with tremendous force. She had dreamed of this moment for years, but now that it was happening, her mind was completely focused on the mission. The Raptor lifted off smoothly and climbed rapidly toward the intercept coordinates. Sarah checked her instruments and adjusted her heading. The aircraft felt like an extension of her own body. Every control input produced exactly the response she expected. "Control, this is Raptor 1. Sarah radioed. "Airborne. And proceeding to intercept. Request target information." The air traffic controller's voice came back with coordinates and altitude data. Sarah programmed the information into her navigation system and adjusted her flight path. She was now flying at over 40,000 feet, traveling at nearly twice the speed of sound. As she approached the target area, Sarah activated the F-22's advanced radar system. The aircraft's stealth technology would keep her invisible to most detection systems, giving her a significant advantage in identifying the unknown aircraft. Her radar picked up the target immediately. It was a small civilian aircraft flying an unusual pattern near the restricted airspace. Sarah maneuvered closer to get a visual identification. What she saw surprised her. The aircraft was an older Cessna, flying erratically. Through her powerful camera systems, Sarah could see that there was only one person in the cockpit, and something was clearly wrong. The pilot appeared to be slumped over the controls. "Control, this is Raptor 1, Sarah radioed. "Target is a civilian Cessna, single occupant. Pilot appears to be unconscious or incapacitated. Aircraft is flying on autopilot, but heading toward restricted airspace." This changed everything. This wasn't an enemy probe or a security threat. This was an emergency situation involving a civilian pilot who needed help. Sarah had trained for scenarios like this during her civilian flying, but never in a military fighter aircraft. The control tower immediately patched her through to emergency services and medical personnel. A flight surgeon came on the radio to help assess the situation. Sarah positioned her F-22 alongside the smaller aircraft, close enough to see into the cockpit clearly. The civilian pilot was definitely unconscious, probably from a medical emergency like a heart attack or stroke. The autopilot was keeping the Cessna flying straight and level, but it would eventually run out of fuel or continue into airspace where it could cause serious problems. Sarah had to make another critical decision. She could simply monitor the aircraft until other resources arrived, or she could take action to help guide it to safety. The problem was that the nearest airport capable of handling an emergency landing was 20 minutes away, and the Cessna's erratic flight path suggested the autopilot system might not be functioning properly. "Control," Sarah radioed. "I'm going to attempt to guide the civilian aircraft toward Riverside Airport. It's the closest suitable landing field, and we need to get this pilot medical attention as quickly as possible." Flying alongside the smaller aircraft, Sarah began a delicate maneuver. She used her F-22's advanced flight systems to create precise air currents that could influence the Cessna's flight path. It was an incredibly difficult technique that required perfect understanding of aerodynamics and aircraft behavior. Sarah had read about this procedure in military manuals, but she had never attempted it herself. She positioned her fighter just ahead and slightly above the civilian aircraft, using her wingtip vortices to create gentle pressure that encouraged the Cessna to turn toward the airport. The technique worked. Slowly, the civilian aircraft began to change course. Sarah maintained her position carefully, making tiny adjustments to keep both aircraft safe while gradually guiding the Cessna toward the emergency landing site. On the ground, emergency crews were racing to Riverside Airport. Ambulances, fire trucks, and rescue personnel were taking positions along the runway. The airport had cleared all other traffic and activated their full emergency response protocol. Sarah stayed with the civilian aircraft as it approached the airport. The unconscious pilot couldn't lower the landing gear or adjust the aircraft for landing, so the approach would be dangerous. Sarah radioed ahead with information about the aircraft's speed, altitude, and condition. "Riverside Tower. The civilian aircraft is maintaining steady flight, but no response from pilot. Recommend foam on runway and full emergency response. Aircraft appears to have sufficient fuel for approach." As the Cessna lined up with the runway, Sarah had to make another split-second decision. The civilian aircraft was coming in too fast and at the wrong angle. Without intervention, it would likely crash short of the runway or overshoot into buildings beyond the airport. Sarah positioned her F-22 one more time, using her aircraft's wake to help slow the Cessna and adjust its glide path. It was incredibly dangerous flying, requiring her to operate her fighter aircraft just hundreds of feet from the ground, while maintaining precise formation with an uncontrolled civilian plane. The Cessna touched down hard but safely on the runway. Emergency crews immediately surrounded the aircraft and extracted the unconscious pilot, who was rushed to the hospital. Sarah circled overhead until she was certain the situation was under control. "Control. This is Raptor 1, she radioed. "Civilian aircraft down safely. Pilot in medical care. Mission complete." As Sarah climbed back to altitude and headed home, she realized that her life had just changed completely. In the space of 1 hour, she had gone from being an unknown mechanic to successfully completing one of the most unusual rescue missions in Air Force history. The radio chatter on her return flight told her that word of her actions was already spreading. Her base commander was waiting for a full briefing, and apparently several high-ranking officers wanted to speak with her immediately upon landing. Sarah looked down at the landscape passing beneath her F-22 and smiled. She had finally gotten her chance to prove what she could do, and she hadn't wasted it. But she also knew that the real challenges were just beginning. When she landed back at her base, there was a crowd waiting on the tarmac. It included her commanding officer, several pilots she had worked with for years, and maintenance crews who still couldn't believe what had happened. Sarah taxied to parking and shut down the engines, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. As she climbed out of the cockpit, Major Peterson approached with an expression that mixed amazement, confusion, and a little bit of anger. "Chen," he said. The debriefing room was packed with more high-ranking officers than Sarah had ever seen in one place. Base Commander Colonel Martinez sat at the head of the table, flanked by Major Peterson and several other officials she didn't recognize. Sarah stood at attention, still wearing her flight suit, as they reviewed her actions. "Sergeant Chen," Colonel Martinez began, "what you did today was either the most remarkable piece of flying this base has ever seen, or the most serious breach of protocol in our history. I haven't decided which yet." Sarah maintained her composure. "Sir, I followed emergency procedures and responded to a threat that required immediate action. I had the qualifications and the available aircraft to complete the mission successfully. But you've been hiding those qualifications for 5 years," Major Peterson interjected. "Why didn't you tell us you could fly?" Sarah took a deep breath. This was the moment she had been dreading and hoping for simultaneously. "Sir, I tried to enter pilot training multiple times when I first joined the service. Each time, there were administrative issues, timing problems, or other obstacles. After several attempts, I concluded that the system wasn't ready to accept me as a pilot." One of the unknown officers leaned forward. Sarah could see from his uniform that he was a general. "What kind of obstacles, Sergeant?" "Paperwork errors that delayed my applications, medical exam mix-ups that never got corrected, and training slots that were mysteriously filled just before my applications were processed. It happened consistently enough that I began to suspect it wasn't just bad luck." The room was silent for a moment. General Harrison, as Sarah learned his name was, exchanged glances with Colonel Martinez. They both knew that what Sarah was describing had unfortunately happened to other qualified candidates over the years, particularly women and minorities who sought to enter male-dominated specialties. "So you decided to become a mechanic instead," Colonel Martinez said. "I decided to serve in whatever capacity would let me work with aircraft and contribute to the mission. I continued my civilian flight training on my own time because I loved flying, but I never intended to cause problems for anyone." General Harrison opened a folder and reviewed several documents. "Sergeant Chen, we've been checking your records. Your maintenance evaluations are outstanding. You've received commendations from pilots throughout this base. And according to the civilian flight school where you trained, you're one of the most skilled pilots they've ever worked with." Sarah nodded. "Flying has always come naturally to me, sir. I studied every aircraft manual I could find, practiced procedures during maintenance breaks, and tried to learn everything possible about military aviation operations." "The civilian pilot you rescued today," Major Peterson said, "his name is Robert Williams. He's a 7-year-old retired teacher who suffered a heart attack while flying his Cessna. The doctors say that if you hadn't guided his aircraft to that airport when you did, he would have crashed in a residential area or run out of fuel over water. You saved his life, and possibly the lives of people on the ground." This was the first Sarah had heard about the pilot's condition. She felt a mix of relief and pride, knowing that her actions had made a real difference. General Harrison stood up. "Sergeant Chen, your unauthorized flight today violated numerous regulations and protocols. Under normal circumstances, you would face serious disciplinary action." Sarah felt her heart sink. She had known this moment would come, but hearing it stated so clearly was difficult. However, the general continued, "Your actions also demonstrated exceptional skill, sound judgment, and a commitment to saving lives that exemplifies the best values of the Air Force. The question now is what we do next." Colonel Martinez opened another folder. "Sarah, we've spent the last 4 hours reviewing your entire service record and your civilian flight training documentation. We've also spoken with Mike Patterson, your civilian instructor, and Colonel Davis, the retired test pilot who has flown with you." Sarah was surprised they had tracked down her civilian connections so quickly. "Both of them told us that your flying abilities are extraordinary." Colonel Davis used the word exceptional several times. He said that in 40 years of military aviation, including time as a test pilot, he's rarely seen natural flying talent like yours. General Harrison picked up where Colonel Martinez left off. "We also reviewed the flight data from your mission today. Your aircraft handling, decision-making under pressure, and successful completion of an extremely difficult rescue operation were all textbook perfect." Sarah wasn't sure where this conversation was leading, but she sensed it might not be the disciplinary action she had expected. "Sergeant Chen," General Harrison said, "we have a problem. The Air Force needs skilled pilots more than ever. We have advanced aircraft and complex missions that require the best people we can find. Yet somehow, we've had one of our most talented potential pilots working as a mechanic for 5 years because our system failed to recognize her abilities." He paused and looked around the room. "That's not just a loss for you, Sergeant Chen. That's a loss for the entire Air Force and for national security." Major Peterson stood up. "Sarah, how would you feel about finally getting the chance to become an official military pilot?" The question hit Sarah like a shockwave. After years of being told no, of watching other pilots fly the missions she dreamed of, someone was finally asking if she wanted to join them. "Sir, there's nothing I want more than to serve as a pilot, but I thought that opportunity had passed." "Not if we have anything to say about it," General Harrison replied. "We're prepared to fast-track you through an abbreviated pilot training program. Your extensive civilian experience and your proven ability to handle our most advanced fighter aircraft suggest that you could complete the program quickly." Colonel Martinez added, "We're also going to investigate what happened with your previous applications. If there was discrimination or systemic bias involved, we need to identify it and fix it so it doesn't happen to other qualified candidates." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the sudden change in her circumstances. "What about my current duties? The maintenance crews depend on me. We'll work out the transition gradually," Major Peterson assured her. "Your mechanical knowledge actually makes you more valuable as a pilot, not less. Understanding aircraft systems at the level you do is a huge advantage in the cockpit." General Harrison walked over to Sarah and extended his hand. "Sergeant Chen, on behalf of the United States Air Force, I want to apologize for the obstacles you faced earlier in your career, and I want to thank you for not giving up on your goal of serving your country, even when the system failed you." Sarah shook his hand, still hardly believing what was happening. "There's one more thing," Colonel Martinez said. "Your actions today saved a civilian's life, but they also demonstrated capabilities that could be valuable in other situations. We'd like you to consider training for special operations missions that require the kind of flying skills you showed today." Over the following months, Sarah's life changed dramatically. She entered an accelerated pilot training program designed for experienced aviators transitioning to military aircraft. Her civilian flying background and her deep knowledge of aircraft systems allowed her to progress much faster than typical students. Her fellow trainees, all traditional military pilots, were initially skeptical about the mechanic who claimed she could fly. That skepticism disappeared quickly when they saw her performance in the air. Sarah consistently scored at the top of her class in every phase of training. Word of her rescue mission had spread throughout the Air Force community. Pilots who had worked with her as a mechanic now understood why she had always seemed to know so much about flying techniques and aircraft capabilities. Many of them admitted they had always sensed there was more to Sarah than she revealed. Mike Patterson, her civilian instructor, was invited to the base for Sarah's graduation from pilot training. He watched with pride as she received her wings and her commission as a second lieutenant. "I always knew this day would come," he told her. "I just didn't know it would take so long." Jake's the Dest 5. "I just didn't know it would take so long." Robert Williams, the civilian pilot Sarah had rescued, also attended the ceremony. He had made a full recovery from his heart attack and wanted to thank Sarah personally. "Young lady," he said, "you gave me a second chance at life. I'll never forget what you did." Sarah's first assignment as a military pilot was to a squadron that specialized in complex rescue and intercept missions. Her unique combination of mechanical knowledge, exceptional flying skills, and experience with emergency situations made her perfect for the role. On her first official mission, Sarah found herself flying alongside some of the same pilots whose aircraft she had maintained for years. Captain Rodriguez, who had always trusted her mechanical work, now trusted her as his wingman. "It's strange," he told her over the radio during a training flight, "but somehow this feels right. Like you were always supposed to be up here with us." Lieutenant Brooks, whose aircraft Sarah had inspected countless times, was amazed by her performance. "Chen, I always knew you understood these planes better than anyone. Now, I know why." Sarah's story became well known throughout the Air Force as an example of how talent can be overlooked by bureaucratic systems, but also how determination and skill will eventually find a way to shine. Her case led to reviews of pilot selection processes and efforts to ensure that qualified candidates weren't lost due to administrative problems or bias. 2 years after her rescue mission, Sarah was promoted to captain and assigned to test new aircraft systems. Her combination of pilot skills and mechanical expertise made her invaluable for evaluating how new technologies performed in real flight conditions. She often thought about the morning when she had made the decision to step forward and volunteer for that emergency mission. It had been a moment of courage that changed not just her life, but also improved the Air Force's ability to recognize and develop talent wherever it might be found. Sarah kept in touch with the maintenance crews at her original base. She made sure they knew that her success hadn't made her forget where she came from or the people who had supported her along the way. She often visited during training exercises, working alongside mechanics, and sharing her unique perspective as someone who had served on both sides of the flight line. The F-22 Raptor that Sarah had flown during her rescue mission was eventually retired and put on display at the base museum. A plaque near the aircraft told the story of the day when an unknown mechanic revealed herself to be an ace pilot and saved a life in the process. Sarah's career continued to flourish. She became known throughout the military as one of the most skilled pilots of her generation. Someone who could handle any aircraft and any mission with equal competence. But she never forgot the lesson of her early years. That talent and determination matter more than recognition, and that sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in plain sight, waiting for their moment to shine. The young mechanics who worked under Sarah's supervision as a pilot often heard her tell them that their current job didn't define their ultimate potential. She encouraged them to pursue their dreams and develop their skills, knowing that opportunity could come at any moment for those who were prepared to seize it. Years later, when asked about the most important moment in her career, Sarah always mentioned the day she decided to step forward in that hangar. "It wasn't the flying that mattered most," she would say, but the decision to stop hiding her abilities and trust that the world was ready for what she had to offer.